Despite a long-running property crisis and Trump's unprecedented tariffs, the Chinese economy has held up surprisingly well. Domestically, declines in property investment have been mostly offset by increased investment in high-tech manufacturing. And while exports to the US have fallen somewhat, they haven't fallen as much as you might expect. And Chinese producers have apparently been able to offset any decline by just redirecting their exports elsewhere, including to Europe. Nonetheless, in the past month or so, the Chinese economy has shown new signs of strain, and a combination of debt and deflation take their toll on industry. So in this video, we're going to explain how the Chinese economy outperformed expectations over the past couple of years, and what's gone wrong. Have you ever wondered how much money TLDR makes each year? Or who's funding our journalism? Well, we think transparency is super important. So we answer both questions in our recent video. It's linked in the description. So to understand China's current economic woes, you need to understand how the Chinese economy is fundamentally unbalanced. In short, GDP is defined as the sum of four things: government spending, business investment, household consumption, and the difference between exports and imports. In China, consumption accounts for a lower than average share of GDP, while investment and net exports account for a higher than average share. A recent analysis by the University of Groningen found that, in 2019, household consumption accounted for 39% of China's GDP, compared to a global average of about 60%. For context, in most large European countries, household consumption accounted for about 50% of GDP. In India, it accounted for about 65%, and in the US, it accounted for about 70%. This is largely because, through a variety of mechanisms, including an undervalued currency, China essentially underpays its workers, keeping them poor and keeping China's exports competitive. Conversely, investment accounts for a disproportionately large share of Chinese GDP. World Bank data, for instance, suggests that investment made up 41% of Chinese GDP in 2023, compared to a global average of 23%. Again, to give some more context, in India, investment accounted for about 33% of GDP, and in the US, it was 21%. In and of itself, lots of investment isn't a bad thing, but too much investment can lead to a country producing essentially too much stuff. This is sort of what's happened in Chinese industry. China produces more stuff than its population can consume, which is why it runs persistent trade surpluses. But it also happened in China's property sector. Chinese property developers essentially built too many houses, hence those infamous videos of China's ghost cities, and then had to take out unsustainable amounts of debt to keep themselves afloat. As you might remember, to remedy this, in late 2020, the CCP introduced the so-called 3 red lines, which essentially limited how much debt developers could take on. This was terrible news for heavily indebted developers like Evergrande, and triggered a dramatic slowdown in China's property market. Now, usually you'd expect this sort of slowdown to lead to a decrease in overall GDP. After all, a property crisis would usually mean a reduction in investment, as developers pare back construction, and potentially a decrease in consumption, as homeowners cautiously pare back their spending in reaction to declines in property prices. However, this didn't really happen. Instead, as this very helpful graph by Brad Setzer at the Council on Foreign Relations neatly illustrates, investment was essentially redirected from property into manufacturing and infrastructure. This was largely a consequence of the CCP's practice of setting GDP targets for provincial governments. For context, unlike the rest of the world, where GDP growth is measured as an output of statistical authorities at the end of the year, in China, the central government sets GDP targets for provincial governments at the beginning of the year. In other words, GDP isn't just an output, but also an input. Under pressure to hit their GDP targets, local governments essentially just redirected their investment spending from property into other industries, especially politically favourable ones identified as new productive forces by the CCP. For a while, this strategy seemed to be working. While there was indeed a mismatch between consumption and production, Chinese producers were able to bridge the gap with exports. In other words, selling their surplus to foreign consumers. This helped boost GDP growth and allowed China to establish market dominance in high-tech industries like EVs. Even when Trump's tariffs kicked in, which obviously made it harder for Chinese producers to sell to the US, exports held up impressively well, with Chinese exporters redirecting their surplus to Europe and other markets in Southeast Asia and Latin America. You can see this if you break down China's most recent export data by region. While exports to the US have indeed fallen compared to 2024, exports to the rest of the world have held steady or increased. However, this strategy always felt somewhat unsustainable. Other countries were neither economically able nor politically willing to absorb China's surplus forever. And even though exports were holding up relatively well, China was still clearly producing too much, as evidenced by the brutal price wars we saw in industries like solar panels and EVs recently. Price wars aren't necessarily bad, but in China they contributed to the pre-existing deflation crisis, and encouraged affected companies, and the local government supporting them, to take out unsustainable amounts of debt in an attempt to survive the price wars. This is a big reason why China's total debt now stands at over 300% of GDP, up from about 200% only a decade ago. Anyway, it now looks like this strategy is indeed running out of road. Prices can't go much lower, and affected companies can't take out much more debt, which is why, according to the latest data release from China's National Bureau of Statistics, in July, growth in both manufacturing and infrastructure investment declined dramatically. More generally, both industrial production and corporate investment fell markedly, with fixed asset investment falling from about 4% growth year-on-year earlier this year to 1.6% in July, and industrial production falling from 6.8% in June to 5.7% in July. This is in part because domestic demand has weakened further, with year-on-year growth in retail sales falling to a 6-month low of 3.7%, presumably at least in part because consumers are responding to deflation by paring back their spending. Weak domestic demand will obviously make things even harder for China's embattled producers, because, well, weak demand makes it harder to sell stuff. Weak demand also seems to have restarted China's property crisis, with home prices in urban areas, which seem to have stabilised somewhat in late 2024, resuming their declines in the past couple of months. All in all, this is yet more evidence that China needs to boost consumption as a share of GDP. Excessive investment, whether it's in property or manufacturing, seems to be ultimately unsustainable if it's not matched by domestic demand. More consumption would both rebalance the economy and perhaps even ease trade-related tensions with the rest of the world. After all, more domestic demand would mean both fewer exports, and thus less risk of the politically toxic overcapacity we're seeing at the moment, but also more imports from foreign producers, which would encourage other countries to see trade with China in less zero-sum terms. Now, other China-related news has been covered across the media landscape, including Xi Jinping's planned hosting of Kim Jong-un for China's military parade next week, with 147 sources reporting on it. Taking a closer look, you can see that 20 of these sources come from the right and 40 of them come from the left. It's clear that there are some differences between each side of the political spectrum, with right-leaning outlets focusing on geopolitical tensions and left-leaning outlets emphasising North Korea's deepening economic ties with China and military support for Russia. We're able to get this in-depth analysis thanks to our sponsor this week, Ground News, a website and app that collects articles from around the world, helping you burst your media bubble. For every story just like this one, you're able to see just how many sources are reporting on it, as well as where those sources fall politically. And that's important, as the same story can take a completely different meaning depending on how it's framed to us. Something that we find helps us tackle this problem even further is their fantastic blind spot feature, a newsfeed dedicated to showing us which stories are improperly covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. Here you can expand your own viewpoint, or simply help you understand someone else's media reality. It's no secret that the current media landscape is constantly trying to capture your attention and sway you one way or the other. So having a tool that helps you understand bias and how it affects the media you consume is extremely crucial. If you're interested in staying on top of the news and want to explore more of the amazing features Ground News has to offer, we're offering 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on screen. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started today.